The wheat was dead. Every last stalk of it, from the eastern fence line to the creek bank, lay flattened and blackened against the cracked earth like something the sky itself had reached down and strangled. Wilhelmina Wainwright stood at the edge of her ruined field on a Thursday morning in October of 1882, and she did not scream. She did not rage. She simply dropped to her knees in the dirt and pressed both hands flat against the scorched ground as though she could push life back into it by sheer force of will. And when that did not work, when the earth remained cold and dead beneath her palms, she wept. She wept in a way she had not wept since her father's funeral 2 years prior, in a way that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere closer to the hollow bottom of everything she had ever believed about the future. The harvest was supposed to save her. It was supposed to be the answer to every letter from the bank, every side-glanced comment from the men in town who believed a woman had no business running 400 acres alone, every sleepless night she had spent bent over ledgers by lamplight trying to make numbers add up that simply refused to cooperate. And now it was gone. She did not hear the horse approaching. She did not hear the slow creak of boots hitting packed dirt, the deliberate footsteps of someone who was careful not to startle her. She did not even register the shadow that fell across her until a pair of large, work-roughened hands appeared in her line of sight, not reaching for her shoulders to pull her up, not waving in awkward condolence, but pressing flat against the earth beside her own hands, mirroring her posture exactly, as though whoever knelt beside her understood that what she needed was not comfort spoken from above, but presence felt at the same level. She looked up. Orville Wilcox was not looking at her. He was looking at the dead wheat, his jaw tight, his dark eyes moving slowly across the destruction with the careful assessment of a man who had spent his entire life reading land the way other men read books. He was still pressed into the dirt beside her, his hands bracketing hers in the ruined field, and he said nothing at all. That silence was the thing that broke her completely open and then, somehow, began putting her back together. She had known Orville Wilcox for approximately 6 weeks, which was the length of time he had been working a temporary fence repair job on the neighboring Daly property. She had spoken to him perhaps 4 times in those 6 weeks. She did not know him well enough to understand why his wordless presence in the dirt beside her felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered her in years. But it did, and that was the beginning of everything. 2 months earlier, in August of 1882, Wilhelmina Wainwright had arrived back in Harlow Creek, Texas, after a 3-year absence in Galveston where she had been teaching school. She had left Harlow Creek as a girl of 22 following the death of her mother, unable to watch her ailing father struggle alone with the land they had built together as a family. She had left because staying felt like drowning. She had come back at 25 because her father had died and left her everything he owned, which amounted to 400 acres of prime wheat-growing land, a farmhouse that needed its roof repaired, 2 horses, a mule named Preacher, and a debt to the First National Bank of Harlow Creek that made her stomach turn every time she thought about it. The land was called the Wainwright Place, had always been called that, and Wilhelmina was determined it would keep that name. Harlow Creek in 1882 was the kind of small Texas town that had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. It had a main street with a general store, a post office, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a church with a leaning steeple, and a bank that was owned by a man named Gerald Prout who wore a 3-piece suit in 90-degree heat and smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes. There was also a feed store, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small hotel that served as a boarding house for traveling workers who came through the territory looking for seasonal employment. Wilhelmina had ridden into town on the first day of August aboard a stage coach from San Antonio, carrying 2 trunks, a leather satchel of her father's papers, and the particular kind of quiet determination that develops in a woman who has decided to stop waiting for someone else to fix things. The farm was worse than she had expected. Her father, a gentle and dreamy man named Theodore Wainwright, had spent the last 2 years of his life more interested in reading philosophy than in maintaining irrigation lines, and the evidence of that preference was everywhere. The wheat fields had been planted by a hired hand named Chester Burroughs, who had done a competent if uninspired job, and who had departed for Kansas City 2 weeks before Theodore died, leaving behind a crop that was in the ground and growing, but in desperate need of attention. Wilhelmina had spent the first 3 weeks of her return doing physical labor from before sunrise to after sunset. She repaired fences, cleared irrigation channels, reinforced the granary, and learned things about wheat farming that she had observed as a child but never fully understood as an adult. She hired one part-time helper, a 16-year-old boy named Davy Sims, whose primary qualification was that he was willing to work for wages she could actually afford. The wheat had looked good in September. It had looked genuinely promising. The stalks stood tall and even, the grain heads were filling in, and the local men who had privately been waiting for her to fail had begun to look at the Wainwright fields with a grudging respect that Wilhelmina found deeply satisfying. Then the storm came. It arrived on the night of October 3rd, a violent, twisting darkness that the old-timers in Harlow Creek would later call a black norther, a combination of early cold front and electric storm that crackled through the plains with a ferocity that felt almost personal. It lasted 4 hours. When it was done, Wilhelmina's wheat was destroyed. Not damaged, not partially ruined, destroyed. She had not gone to look at it until morning. She had sat at her kitchen table through the whole night, listening to the storm rage, knowing what it was doing to her crop, unable to do anything about it. By the time she finally walked out into the dawn and saw the scale of the catastrophe, something inside her had already been preparing for grief. But preparation is a different thing from the grief itself, and the grief itself was enormous. She had been on her knees in the ruined field for perhaps 20 minutes when Orville Wilcox arrived. Orville Wilcox was 30 years old, though he carried himself with the economy of movement of a much older man, someone who had learned early that energy was a resource to be conserved. He had grown up in the Oklahoma Territory, the son of a farmer who had come west from Missouri with big ideas that the land repeatedly and mercilessly deflated. He had spent a decade working other people's land across Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, accumulating a knowledge of agriculture that was both wide and deep, and carrying with him a secret that he had never told anyone in Harlow Creek, which was that he had once owned land of his own and lost it. He had lost it to a man named Dalton Ferris, a land speculator with dark past connections to corrupt county officials who had manipulated a drought assessment to seize Orville's homestead claim near Amarillo in 1878. Orville had fought the seizure legally and lost. He had then done something he was not proud of, which was to spend 6 months drunk and drifting through the Texas Panhandle, before a Comanche farmer named Esau who ran a trade post near the Canadian River had given him work and perspective in equal measure, and he had slowly reconstructed himself into someone he could tolerate again. He had come to Harlow Creek in late August following a recommendation from a man he had worked for in Abilene to do fence repair on the Daly property that bordered the Wainwright land to the north. The job was supposed to last 3 weeks. He had been there 6. The reason he had stayed was one he had not fully admitted to himself yet, though it had something to do with the fact that on his 3rd day on the Daly property, he had noticed a woman working alone in the adjacent fields. A tall, straight-backed woman with dark auburn hair, wound up under a straw hat, who moved through the rows of wheat with an efficiency and purposefulness that was unusual and compelling. He had watched her from a respectful distance on several occasions, noting the way she assessed her crop with a practiced eye, the way she spoke to her mule with brisk affection, the way she stood at the fence line in the evenings looking at her fields with an expression that combined pride and worry in equal measure. They had been formally introduced at the Harlow Creek General Store in mid-September, a brief and businesslike exchange facilitated by old Mrs. Garrity, who ran the store and enjoyed introductions the way some people enjoyed hymns, with enthusiastic repetition. "Miss Wainwright, this is Orville Wilcox, been working the daily place," Mrs. Garrity had said, beaming. Wilhelmina had extended her hand in the straightforward manner of someone who had decided years ago that social conventions existed to be observed efficiently and then moved past. "I know who he is," she had said. "I have seen you working the north fence line." Orville had shaken her hand and said, "Yes, ma'am, your wheat looks good." "It does," she had said, and there had been something in the way she said it, a quality of fierce ownership, that he had found himself thinking about later that evening. They had spoken twice more after that, once at the post office where they had arrived simultaneously, and she had let him go ahead of her, and once at the feed store where they had found themselves looking at the same bags of seed grain and had discussed, briefly and knowledgeably, the relative merits of hard red winter wheat versus soft red winter varieties. That conversation had been the longest they had had, perhaps 8 minutes, and Orville had walked away from it with the unsettling sensation of having been in the presence of someone who was thinking faster and harder than almost anyone he had ever encountered, someone who was applying real intelligence to the problem of survival in a place and time that rarely rewarded intelligence in a woman. He had thought about her that night. He had told himself firmly that this was not a productive line of thought. He had thought about her again the next morning. When the Black Norther struck on the night of October 3rd, Orville was in his small room at the daily boarding house listening to the wind and thinking about the Wainwright fields, which he had noted just that afternoon were close to harvest ready. He knew what a storm like this would do to a wheat crop at that stage. He lay awake most of the night with a tension in his chest that he could not quite explain away as simple agricultural concern. In the morning, he had ridden over without thinking about whether it was his place to do so. He had found her already there, already on her knees, already past the point where anyone could have offered words that meant anything at all. And so he had not offered words. He had gotten off his horse, and he had knelt beside her, and he had pressed his hands against the same dead earth she was pressing hers against, and he had stayed. They remained like that for several minutes, neither speaking, both looking at the ruined crop. Then Wilhelmina slowly sat back on her heels and wiped her face with the back of her wrist, a gesture that was purely practical and somehow also desperately brave. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that were already hardening back into determination. "How bad do you think it is?" she asked. Orville stood up and walked forward into the field, moving carefully through the flattened stalks, crouching periodically to examine the damage up close. He spent about 5 minutes doing this while Wilhelmina watched him. When he came back, he crouched in front of her, eye level, which was another thing she noticed, that he chose to come down to her level rather than stand over her. "The stalks themselves are done," he said quietly, "but the roots in the northern quarter held better than the rest. The soil drainage up there protected the root systems a bit. You still have a granary full of whatever Chester Burroughs managed to harvest before he left." Wilhelmina blinked. "How do you know about Chester Burroughs?" "Small town," Orville said simply. "Is the granary at capacity? About a third. That's something." "It is not enough," she said. "The bank is expecting a payment in 30 days based on a full harvest projection. A third of a granary will not make that payment." She paused. "I am aware that I sound as though I am confiding in someone I barely know." "You can stop if you want," Orville said. She looked at him steadily. "I do not want to," she said, and something shifted between them at that admission, small but definite, like a gate opening. He stood up and held out his hand to help her up. She took it. And then, because he did not immediately let go and she did not immediately pull away, they stood for a moment in the ruined field holding hands without any particular justification for doing so, until Wilhelmina looked down at their joined hands with an expression that was half startled and half something else entirely, and then let go. "Can I look at the rest of the property?" Orville asked. "Before you decide anything." She had hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," she said. "Come." They walked the entire 400 acres that morning, Orville asking questions and Wilhelmina answering them with the precision of someone who had learned her land, not through years of working it, but through the intensity of concentrated attention. He was thorough in his assessment, and she appreciated that. The fact that he treated the problem as real and her as capable of understanding the full reality of it without having it softened. What he told her by the time they completed the walk was not encouraging, but it was also not hopeless, which was a better combination than she had expected. The northern quarter roots could support a late barley planting, he said. It's a risk in October, and you'd need to move fast, but barley matures faster than wheat, and if the weather cooperates, you could have something sellable by late November. It wouldn't cover your full payment, but it would make a partial payment possible. And the bank, Wilhelmina said. Gerald Prout has never struck me as a man who responds well to partial payments. Orville's expression did something complicated at the mention of Gerald Prout's name. I have met men like Prout before, he said. They respond better to a conversation that includes a plan than to silence. Go to him before he comes to you. Bring numbers. Show him you are not panicking. I am panicking, Wilhelmina said. I know, Orville said. Do it anyway. She had looked at him for a long moment then, this man she barely knew who had appeared in her ruined field and offered her not sympathy but strategy, not pity but partnership, and she had felt something stir in her chest that she was not prepared to name but also could not deny. The daily job, she said carefully. How much longer does that run? Orville looked out across the dead wheat fields. I told Franklin Daly I'd be done by the end of October. Would he release you from that arrangement 2 weeks early, if someone paid you a fair wage to do something else? Silence fell between them that was heavy with more than just the practical question being asked. That depends on what the something else is, Orville said. Barley planting, Wilhelmina said. Granary repair, irrigation line clearing, and whatever else needs doing to give this place a fighting chance before winter. He nodded slowly. Franklin Daly's a reasonable man, he'd understand. He paused. You'd be comfortable with that arrangement. A man you barely know working your land. I am not comfortable with anything about my current situation, Wilhelmina said honestly. But you have not once in this entire conversation treated me as though I am incapable of handling the truth, and that is more than I can say for most of the men in this county. So yes, I would be comfortable. Something in his face softened very briefly and then steadied. Then I'll talk to Daly today. Franklin Daly turned out to be entirely amenable, particularly after Orville explained the situation with the Wainwright property. Daly was one of the few men in Harlow Creek who had actually respected Theodore Wainwright and harbored a private guilt about not having done more to help the old man in his declining years. Releasing Orville 2 weeks early was, in his mind, a partial restitution. Orville arrived at the Wainwright place at dawn the following morning, which was Friday. Wilhelmina was already awake. She had made coffee, and she had made enough for 2 cups without fully deciding why, which told her more about her own state of mind than she was comfortable with. They sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread between them and mapped out what was possible in the time available. It was a practical conversation conducted between 2 adults who were both accustomed to treating problems as problems to be solved rather than tragedies to be mourned. And it was also one of the most intimate conversations Wilhelmina had had in years, because it was about the real, specific stakes of her real, specific life. And he engaged with those stakes with a seriousness that made her feel seen in a way that was both deeply comforting and mildly terrifying. When they finished going through the numbers, Orville folded the ledger closed and leaned back in his chair, and looked at her with a directness that she had come to recognize as simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. There's one more thing, he said. There always is, she said. Gerald Prout's been buying up distressed properties in this county for the past 2 years, Orville said. The Kelsey Place, the Morrison Homestead, the old Rodriguez Grant land down by the river. Every one of them was a forced sale following a bank payment default. Wilhelmina was very still. "You think Prout is waiting for my default?" "I think a man who wears a three-piece suit in October heat and smiles the way Prout smiles is not purely interested in getting his loan repaid," Orville said. "I think he would be very happy to have 400 acres of Wainwright wheat land added to his portfolio, and I think you should go into that bank with your plan and your numbers and your spine fully erect, and I think you should make it very clear that you are not in the business of defaulting." The word betrayal sat unspoken between them, but they both felt it, the shape of what Prout might have done to other families in this county, the specific danger Wilhelmina was standing at the edge of. "He was at my father's funeral," Wilhelmina said quietly. "He shook my hand and said how sorry he was." "I know," Orville said. "You know a great deal about this town for someone who has only been here 6 weeks, she said. "I listen," he said simply. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. "The men my father owed money to before he went to Prout's bank, do you know anything about those?" Orville paused. "Your father borrowed from Prout because the men he originally owed called in their loans simultaneously, which forced him to seek refinancing. It is possible those original creditors were encouraged to call in their loans." Wilhelmina set her coffee cup down very carefully. "You are telling me this might have been a trap?" "I am telling you it is worth considering," Orville said. The word trap sat in the room like a stone. Wilhelmina stood up and walked to the window and looked out at her dead fields and breathed. She breathed for a long time, and Orville did not rush her. Then she turned around and looked at him with an expression that was pure, refined, undiluted determination. "Then we had better plant that barley," she said. They began work that same morning. Orville Wilcox worked with the focused efficiency of someone who was deeply in his element, and Wilhelmina Wainwright worked beside him with a stubbornness that he found increasingly difficult to look away from. She was not a novice. She had grown up on this land, and her body remembered it even when her mind had to relearn the specifics, and she never once asked him to do something she was not willing to do herself. Davy Sims, her part-time helper, arrived at 7 in the morning, took one look at the dead wheat and the tall stranger working alongside Miss Wainwright, and wisely asked no questions before picking up a hoe. The northern quarter was cleared of dead stalks, and the soil was turned within 2 days. The barley seed Orville had recommended came from the feed store, and the purchase of it depleted a portion of Wilhelmina's remaining cash that made her hands tremble slightly as she counted out the coins, though she kept her face neutral. Orville noticed the trembling hands. He said nothing. He added the barley bags to the wagon without comment and drove them back himself. On the 3rd day of working together, a neighbor arrived. His name was Cornelius Shaughnessy, and he owned the property to the east, a large cattle operation that had been in his family since 1860. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, and accustomed to being treated as the most important person in any room he entered. He rode up to the Wainwright fields with 2 of his ranch hands flanking him, which was the kind of entrance that was meant to imply he had resources and power and was doing you a favor by noticing you existed. "Miss Wainwright," he said, not dismounting. "Heard about your trouble. Terrible thing, that storm." "Good morning, Mr. Shaughnessy," Wilhelmina said pleasantly, straightening from where she had been working on an irrigation line. Shaughnessy looked at Orville. "Who's this?" "Orville Wilcox," Orville said, not looking up from the irrigation channel he was clearing. "He works for you now?" Shaughnessy asked Wilhelmina. "He does." Shaughnessy HMM'd in a way that managed to contain several opinions he had not been asked for. Then he looked back at Wilhelmina with the smile of a man about to offer a favor that will cost the recipient something. "I want you to know," he said, "that my offer from last spring still stands. I will pay a fair price for this property." "More than fair, given the current state of it." "The current state of it is temporary," Wilhelmina said. "The bank payment isn't," Shaughnessy said. There was a pause. Orville had stopped working. He was still crouched by the irrigation channel, but he was now very still. "I am not selling," Wilhelmina said clearly. "I appreciate you riding over." Shaughnessy looked at her for a long moment with the particular frustration of a man who has decided something and discovered that the thing he decided has opinions of its own. "Your father was a practical man," he said. "My father was a dreamer," Wilhelmina replied, "and so am I, but I have better arithmetic skills. Good day, Mr. Shaughnessy." Shaughnessy rode away with a stiffness to his posture that suggested the conversation was not finished from his perspective. When he was out of earshot, Davy Sims let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Orville looked at Wilhelmina with something warm moving through his dark eyes, and she caught it briefly before looking away. "He and Prout play cards together on Thursday evenings," Orville said. "I know," Wilhelmina said. "I have known Cornelius Shaughnessy since I was 8 years old, and he has always been exactly that kind of man." She paused. "How did you know about the card game?" "Mrs. Garrity," he said. Wilhelmina smiled despite herself, a real smile, unguarded, and it altered the landscape of her face in a way that made Orville's chest do something inconvenient. He went back to the irrigation channel. On the 5th day, Wilhelmina went to the bank. She went alone because she had decided that the message she needed to send was one of independence, and because Orville had strongly agreed with that reasoning while spending the night before helping her prepare the presentation she would give to Prout, going over her numbers line by line until they were polished and airtight. Gerald Prout received her in his office with the controlled graciousness of a man who believed he was performing patience. He was 50 years old, gray-haired, and wore his prosperity in the way that certain men wore their worst qualities, openly and without apology. Wilhelmina sat across from him and presented her numbers: the partial granary, the barley planting, the timeline to harvest, the expected yield, the partial payment she could make in 30 days with the balance to follow after barley sale. She was precise and she was calm and she was completely, absolutely prepared for every question he asked. Prout listened to all of it with his hands folded on his desk. Then he said, "The terms of your father's loan require full payment. The terms also allow for renegotiation in the event of documented weather-related crop loss," Wilhelmina said, placing on his desk a copy of the loan document with the relevant clause bookmarked. She had found it the previous evening buried in her father's papers. Orville had not known it was there. She had found it herself at 2 in the morning and felt a surge of vindicated joy that she had immediately wanted to share with him. Prout looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked back up, his face was carefully neutral in the way of a man revising his strategy. "I will need to consult with the board," he said finally. "Of course," Wilhelmina said, gathering her papers. "I will expect to hear from you within the week." She walked out of the bank into the October sunshine and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her heart hammering in a way she refused to let anyone see. Then she walked to her horse, untied her, and rode home. Orville was in the north field when she arrived, working alongside Davy Sims on getting the last of the barley into the ground. He looked up when she rode in and waited, reading her face. "I think I won the first round," she said. He nodded, and the look he gave her was not congratulatory exactly. It was something deeper than that, something that acknowledged the courage that the morning had required and honored it without making a performance of it. "The clause," she added. "The weather renegotiation clause in the loan document. I found it last night." "Your father's lawyer?" Orville asked. "My father himself," she said. "He insisted on it when the loan was drawn up. He told Prout he would not sign without it. Prout apparently agreed because he expected the clause would never matter." A pause. "My father was not always a dreamer. Sometimes he was very specifically and strategically careful." Something crossed Orville's face, a complex and tender expression. "He knew the land could surprise you," he said. "Yes," Wilhelmina said softly. That evening, after Davy Sims had gone home and the tools were put away and the horses fed, Wilhelmina made supper and set 2 plates at the kitchen table without making a particular decision to do so. Orville came in from washing up at the well and sat down across from her without making a particular decision to do so either. They ate together and talked about the barley and the irrigation, and what the weather forecast looked like based on the cloud formations Orville had observed. And at some point, the conversation drifted from the practical to the personal in the way of water finding its natural path. She told him about Galveston and the school where she had taught, the Gulf breezes and the students who had surprised her with their hunger to learn, the colleagues who had been kind and the ones who had been condescending, and what it had felt like to stand at the water's edge on a Sunday morning and understand that she could make a life in that beautiful city, and that she did not want to, because the land she was made of was somewhere else. He listened the way he did everything with his full attention, and she noticed that he never looked around the room or out the window when she was talking. He always looked at her, which was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. "Why did you really stay in Harlow Creek?" she asked him when the supper was done and they were sitting with tea in the evening quiet. "The daily job should have been finished 3 weeks ago by your own account." He looked at his tea for a moment. "I told myself it was because the weather looked uncertain and Franklin Daly kept finding more work to do. And the real reason," he looked up, "I think you know the real reason." Silence fell between them, not the heavy silence of unspoken problems, but the weighted silence of something acknowledged before its time, something that both of them understood was real, but that neither of them was entirely prepared to act on yet. "You have a dark past," she said, not accusingly but carefully feeling her way toward the truth of him. "Not dark as in wicked, dark as in buried." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her about the homestead near Amarillo, about Dalton Ferris and the corrupt county officials and the forced sale, about the 6 months that followed, the drift and the drinking and the gradual, painful reconstruction. He told it plainly, without self-pity, but she could hear in the flatness of his voice the way those events had arranged themselves inside him, becoming part of the structure rather than the surface. "And now you are here," she said, "helping someone else save their land." "Yes," he said. "Because you know what it feels like to lose it." "Yes," he said, and then very quietly, "and because it is your land." The distinction mattered. She heard it. She looked at him with the careful, assessing gaze of someone who had learned to distinguish between people who wanted to help her and people who wanted to help themselves to her situation, and what she saw in his face was the former, purely and completely. "Orville," she said. "Wilhelmina," he said back, and the way he said her full name, not Willa, not Mina, her full name, the way a person says a name they have been thinking for a long time, made something warm and irrevocable happen in her chest. Neither of them did anything about it. They finished their tea. He thanked her for supper and went to the small bunk in the barn that she had offered, and he had accepted without the elaborate self-deprecation that some men performed when accepting hospitality from women. The self-deprecation, she had always found, was more about the men than about the women. She sat at the table after he left and looked at the 2 cups and thought about secrets and sacrifice, and how it was that you could spend 3 years building a life in a beautiful city by the sea and still feel less fully yourself than you did sitting at a kitchen table in a troubled farmhouse in October. The following week brought a response from the bank. Pruitt's letter was formal and brief, and granted a 60-day extension on the payment in light of the documented weather event, with the full payment plus an additional fee to be received by December 15th. It was not the renegotiation Wilhelmina had hoped for, but it was better than foreclosure, and the additional fee, while painful, was survivable if the barley came in as projected. She read the letter twice, folded it precisely, and went out to where Orville was repairing the granary roof. 60 days, she said, shading her eyes to look up at him. He looked down from the roof with a focused expression. "The additional fee." "Manageable," she said. He nodded and went back to work. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. He set down his hammer and looked at her with patient attention. "I cannot pay you what you deserve," she said. "What I offered you is fair for farm labor, but it is not fair for what you have actually been doing, which is thinking alongside me and doing the work of 3 people. I want you to know that I am aware of the discrepancy and that I intend to correct it when I am able." Orville was quiet for a moment. "I'm not keeping score," he said. "I am," she said, "because it matters to me that you are not taken advantage of, and I will not accept that standard from myself any more than I accept it from men like Prout." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, complex and warm and slightly pained all at once. "You are," he said, "the most honest person I have met in a very long time." "I try to be," she said simply. He came down from the roof then, climbing the ladder with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with heights, and when he reached the ground he was close to her, closer than the practical distance of colleagues, and she did not step back. "Wilhelmina," he said. "Yes," she said, looking up at him. He reached up and removed a piece of dried straw from her hair very carefully, and held it for a moment before dropping it, and the gesture was so gentle and so unnecessary, and so completely his that she felt her heart do something it had not done in a very long time, a kind of leap that was also a landing, simultaneously, as though arriving somewhere and departing from somewhere else at the same moment. "The barley is coming up," he said. "Yes," she said, her voice slightly altered. "It is." "Good signs," he said. "Very good signs," she agreed. They stood there for another 3 seconds that felt much longer, and then she became aware that Davy Sims was approaching with a question about the water trough, and the moment dissolved into the practical afternoon, which was probably just as well. November arrived with a cold that bit into the mornings and softened by midday into something almost warm, which was ideal for the barley. The crop was coming in far better than Orville's conservative projections had suggested it might, the northern quarter soil proving unusually generous for late-season planting, and by mid-November there were stretches of green across the devastated field that made Wilhelmina stand at the fence line in the evenings with something fragile and hopeful moving across her face. Orville always seemed to be nearby when she stood at the fence line in the evenings. He was never obviously seeking her out. He was always appearing on his way between one task and another, but she had begun to understand that this was something he did, that the proximity was intentional in the unacknowledged way that certain intentions are. She started leaving his coffee cup out in the mornings. He started timing his walk from the barn to coincide with when she stepped onto the porch. Neither of them said anything about any of this. They were in town on the second Saturday of November when the situation with Prout became more complicated. Wilhelmina was at the post office, and Orville was at the feed store when Mrs. Garrity, who was also the town's most reliable source of information, found him and pressed his arm with a face full of the particular agitation of someone who knows something dangerous. "That landman," she said in a low, urgent voice. "Ferris, he's in town." Orville went very still. "Dalton Ferris," he said. "Arrived on the Thursday stage," Mrs. Garrity said. "Staying at the hotel. He and Prout had dinner together last night." Orville's expression did something controlled and dangerous. He thanked Mrs. Garrity and walked to the post office, where Wilhelmina was just emerging with a bundle of letters. She took one look at his face and went still. "What happened?" he told her. He told her about Dalton Ferris, the land speculator who had taken his homestead, whom he had not seen in 4 years and never expected to encounter again. He told her that Ferris being in town and dining with Prout was not a coincidence. It was a pattern he recognized from 4 years ago, a partnership between a bank that engineered distress and a speculator who purchased the resulting distress at reduced prices, splitting the profit between them. "He is here for my land," Wilhelmina said, "not a question." "I believe so," Orville said. The betrayal in her expression was deep and specific, the betrayal of someone who had followed every rule and done every correct thing and still found themselves the target of men whose only skill was exploitation. "What do we do?" she asked. Orville looked at her directly. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and you may decide it changes your willingness to have me working your land." She waited. "Ferris doesn't only know me as someone he took land from," Orville said. "After it happened, after I spent 6 months in the kind of state I told you about, I went back to Amarillo and I confronted him. I was not in a good state of mind. Words were exchanged that I am not entirely proud of. There are men in the Texas Panhandle who consider me someone with a grudge against Dalton Ferris. Do you have a grudge against Dalton Ferris? She asked. I have a clear-eyed assessment of exactly what kind of man he is, Orville said. Then the fact that he is here is not a coincidence in another sense either, she said carefully. He is not only here for my land, he knows you are here. Orville was quiet for a moment. It is possible. Someone told him, she said. Mrs. Garrity mentioned my name to multiple people on multiple occasions since I arrived, he said. I did not think anything of it at the time. Wilhelmina pressed her lips together and thought. So the trap is more specific than I understood, she said. It is not only about the Wainwright land. It is about using the Wainwright land to draw you in, and then using your past confrontation with Ferris to do something. Discredit me, Orville said. If I am known to have a prior conflict with Ferris, and I am working your land when Prout challenges the loan, anything I say or do in your defense looks like revenge motivation rather than honest testimony. And without your credibility, Wilhelmina said, my case for the renegotiation is only mine alone, and a lone woman arguing against a bank in 1882 Texas is not a contest with predictable outcomes. The forced choice sat clearly between them. Orville could walk away from the Wainwright property to protect Wilhelmina's legal position, removing the conflict of interest shadow, or he could stay and risk being used against her. You should leave, Wilhelmina said. No, Orville said. Orville, no, he said again, and there was a quality in his voice that was not stubbornness but something more fundamental, a line he had drawn for himself and was not going to step back from. I am not walking away from your land because men like Ferris have decided my presence is inconvenient for them. I did that once. I left my own land rather than continue the fight, and I have spent 4 years understanding exactly what it cost. I do not want you making an ultimate sacrifice for my sake, she said. I mean that. My land is not worth your peace. He looked at her with an expression that was so direct and so warm and so absolutely certain that she felt something give way inside her, a wall she had not known she was maintaining until the moment it fell. Your land is not why I'm staying, he said. The afternoon sunlight of Harlow Creek's Main Street fell around them in a golden, ordinary way while something extraordinary rearranged itself between them. Then why? She asked, though she already knew. You know why, he said. She did know. She had known for some time. She folded her bundle of letters and held them against her chest and looked at him with clear eyes. This is terrible timing, she said. Probably, he agreed. We should get back to the farm, she said. Yes, he said. They rode back together in the afternoon light, not touching, not speaking about it, but riding close enough that their horses occasionally drifted together on the road, and neither of them corrected the drift. The next development came faster than expected. Ferris made his move within the week. He approached the Harlow Creek County Recorder's office and filed a request for a legal assessment of the Wainwright property, citing an alleged prior claim by a family named Aldrich, who had supposedly owned a portion of the land before the Wainwrights arrived in Texas in 1858. It was a fabricated claim, transparently so, but it was the kind of claim that could tie up a land title in legal proceedings long enough to make a bank payment default inevitable. The county recorder, a man named Wilson whose friendship with Prout was well known, had accepted the filing. Wilhelmina found out about it on a Tuesday morning when the county notice arrived with her mail. She read it standing at the kitchen table, and her face went completely white and then completely still. Orville came in from the barn and saw her face and took the letter without being asked and read it himself. Aldrich, he said. Do you know that name? There is no Aldrich claim on this land, she said. My father researched the title before purchasing the original acreage in 1861. The chain of ownership goes back to the original Texas land grant of 1840, and it is clean. Do you have those documents? I have everything, she said. My father kept meticulous records. He was a dreamer about crops, but he was obsessive about paper. Then we need a lawyer, Orville said. The nearest decent lawyer is in San Antonio, she said. Write to him today, Orville said, and I need to make a trip to the county seat. She looked at him. For what? Because I know a man who knows a man in the Texas Land Office in Austin, Orville said, and a fraudulent prior claim filing should interest the state land office considerably, especially when it is connected to a pattern of similar filings. Wilhelmina's eyes sharpened. Are there similar filings? The properties Pruitt acquired, Orville said. The Kelsey Place, the Morrison Homestead, the Rodriguez Grant land. I want to know how those forced sales were initiated. I want to know if Ferris was in this county before. She sat down. You have been thinking about this for a while, she said. Since the day you told me about the other properties, he said, you did not mention it. I was not certain enough to mention it, he said. Now I am. There was a moment of something between them that was gratitude and trust and something larger than both of those things combined. I will write to San Antonio, she said. Today. Good, he said. Then he looked at her with the careful attention that she had come to associate with him being about to say something important. I need you to know something else. Tell me, she said. I am going to be honest with the land office about who I am and about my history with Ferris, he said. I considered not doing that, presenting myself neutrally, but I have made a decision about the kind of man I want to be, and the kind of man I want to be does not hide things when it matters. She held his gaze for a long time. I believe, she said slowly, that is the most important thing you have said to me since you arrived in that field. He nodded once. Be careful, she said. Always, he said. He left for the county seat the following morning. He rode 70 miles to Brenham, where the district land records were held, and where he knew a retired surveyor named Harlan Taft, who had spent 30 years documenting land titles across central Texas, and who owed Orville a favor from a time Orville had testified on his behalf in a property dispute in Abilene. Harlan Taft was 70 years old, white-bearded, and possessed of a memory for land titles that was legendary in the region. When Orville arrived at his small office above the hardware store in Brenham and laid out the situation, Harlan listened without interruption and then sat very still for a long time. Ferris, Harlan said finally. Dalton Ferris. You know him, Orville said. I know his filing patterns, Harlan said. There is a prior claim filing in this county under that name from 1879, against the Morrison property which you mentioned. It was filed and then withdrawn 3 weeks later after the forced sale went through. Who withdrew it? Orville asked. Ferris himself, Harlan said. It was a ghost filing, meant to create legal uncertainty without actually going to adjudication. The uncertainty alone was enough to make the bank call the loan. Can you document the pattern? Orville asked. Harlan Taft stood up very slowly and went to his filing cabinet with the deliberateness of a man who understands exactly what he is doing and why it matters. Write down those property names again, he said. Orville spent 2 days in Brenham with Harlan Taft. What they assembled between them was not quite evidence in the legal sense, but it was a documented pattern of behavior so specific and so consistent that it would be very difficult for any reasonable official to dismiss. Ghost filings, each one withdrawn after a forced sale. Ferris's name appearing in county records in connection with each property, never as the buyer in the initial transaction, always appearing afterward as the purchaser from Pruitt at a price that reflected the depressed value of a distressed sale. Orville sent a full account of these findings by post to the Texas Land Office in Austin, identifying himself by name and his relationship with Ferris explicitly, and then he sent a copy to the lawyer in San Antonio, who was now representing Wilhelmina Wainwright. Then he rode home. He arrived back at the Wainwright farm on a Thursday evening to find Wilhelmina on the porch with a letter in her hand, and an expression on her face that he could not read at distance. He dismounted and walked up to her. What is it? The San Antonio lawyer, she said, handing him the letter. He received your documents and mine together. He says the case is strong. He says if we can demonstrate coordinated fraudulent filing, the original loan terms may be subject to a legal challenge on grounds of bad faith lending. Bad faith lending, Orville said. Prout created the conditions for default deliberately, Wilhelmina said, encouraging my father's original creditors to call in simultaneously, then offering the refinancing he knew he could manipulate. If that can be proven, the debt itself may be invalid, Orville finished. Or significantly restructured in our favor, she said. They stood on the porch in the cool November air looking at each other, and the weight of what was possibly within reach was too large to hold lightly. Orville, she said, and the way she said his name this time was different from all the previous times, warmer and more certain. Yes, he said. She reached out and took his hand, deliberate and clear-eyed, and held it. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and what she saw in his eyes was not surprise but relief, the relief of something arriving exactly where it was always meant to arrive. "Thank you," she said. "Not for this." She gestured at the letter. "I mean for the field. For getting on your knees in the ruined field. That was when I understood what kind of man you were." He squeezed her hand. "I only did what was true," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the reason for the thanks." The barley harvest came in on the 22nd of November, early by any reasonable calculation and impressive in its yield given the circumstances. It was not a full wheat harvest, but it was significantly better than Wilhelmina's most hopeful projections, and with the granary already at a third capacity, the combined amount was enough to make a credible partial payment that, combined with the legal challenge now in motion, gave her a position of considerable strength. The legal challenge moved quickly, faster than Orville had expected, largely because the Texas Land Office took the pattern documentation seriously and assigned an investigator who arrived in Harlow Creek on the 30th of November and spent 3 days reviewing county records with a thoroughness that made Gerald Prout visibly agitated. Dalton Ferris left town on the second day of the investigation. He left quietly without announcement, which was itself a kind of confession, and Orville watched him ride out on the northern road from the edge of the Wainwright property with an expression that was not triumph but something quieter and more enduring than triumph, a setting down of something heavy that he had carried for 4 years. Wilhelmina was beside him when he watched Ferris leave. She had seen his face and understood what the moment meant. "It is done," she said quietly. "It is," he said. She slipped her hand through his arm and leaned against him very slightly, and he looked down at her with the particular expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck and intends to spend considerable time being grateful for it. The formal legal resolution took until mid-December. The investigators' report to the Texas Land Office documented the pattern of fraudulent filings and confirmed Orville's account. The San Antonio lawyer used the report to negotiate with the bank's board directly, going over Prout's head, and the result was a refinancing of the original Wainwright loan under significantly improved terms, with the additional fee waived, the payment deadline extended to March 1st, and the interest rate reduced. Gerald Prout did not resign from the bank, but he was placed under a supervisory restriction by the board that effectively ended his ability to manage loans independently. He remained in Harlow Creek, wearing his 3-piece suits in winter weather, but something in the way the town looked at him had shifted, quietly but definitively, the way things shift when the truth of a hidden motive is finally made plain. Cornelius Shaughnessy stopped making offers to purchase the Wainwright property. Franklin Daly came by in December with a bottle of whiskey, and the information that he had spoken to 3 other property owners in the county who had been through similar forced sale processes, and who were now in contact with the San Antonio lawyer about their own situations. He shook Orville's hand for a very long time and did not say very much, which was how Franklin Daly expressed the deepest things. Christmas came to Harlow Creek in 1882 with a clean cold that was nothing like the Black Norther, simply winter doing its honest work on the land. Wilhelmina spent 2 days before Christmas at her kitchen table writing letters, to the San Antonio lawyer, to Harlan Taft in Brenham, to the county recorder Wilson, who had accepted Ferris's ghost filing and who had been formally cautioned, to several farm supply contacts she had been building relationships with for the spring wheat planting. She was a woman building something, with clarity of purpose and a specific set of tools, and the watching of her doing it was one of the most satisfying things Orville had ever experienced. He spent those same 2 days in the small workshop beside the barn, which he had repaired and organized in October, constructing a new kitchen table to replace the one Wilhelmina's that was beginning to show serious structural fatigue. He had not announced this project. When she came into the kitchen on Christmas Eve morning and found the new table standing exactly where the old one had been, solid and level and built to last a generation, she stood in the doorway for a long moment. "When did you do this?" She said, "Past few days," he said from behind his coffee cup. She walked to the table and ran her hand across the surface, which was sanded smooth and finished with linseed oil. She did not speak for a moment. "It is beautiful," she said. "It's practical," he said. "It is both," she said, and she looked at him over the table with the full weight of her feelings for him visible in her expression for the first time, not managed, not contained, simply present, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. He set his coffee cup down and stood up and came around the table, and she did not move. And when he stood in front of her, he reached up and held her face in both his large, work-roughened hands with infinite gentleness, and she reached up and held his wrists, and he kissed her. It was a slow, honest, serious kiss in the way that everything about Orville Wilcox was slow and honest and serious. And it was the first time, and it was exactly right. And when it was done, she kept her hands on his wrists, and he kept his hands on her face, and they looked at each other with the clear-eyed, happy sobriety of two people who have arrived somewhere after a long journey and know exactly where they are. "I love you," she said. "I have been aware of it for several weeks." "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you said it is both to a table." She laughed, a full, unguarded, beautiful laugh that he had been waiting a long time to hear, and then she pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood in the kitchen with the winter light coming through the window onto the new table, and the whole long, complicated, honest months of arriving here settling into a peace that neither of them had expected to find this clearly. Christmas Day they spent together at the farm, having accepted no invitations from town, because neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. Mrs. Garrity had sent over a small ham and a jar of preserved peaches with a note that said only "well done" in her distinctive spiky handwriting. Davy Sims and his mother came by in the afternoon, Davy excited about the new saddle he had received, his mother pressing Wilhelmina's hand with warm significance and giving Orville a look of approval that was quite frank. In the week between Christmas and New Year's, while the winter barley rested under the cold sky, Orville told Wilhelmina the rest of his story, the parts he had not told her yet. He told her about his mother, who had died of fever when he was 12, and his father's slow decline into bitterness after that, and what it had meant to build his own homestead as a young man, the pure, fierce joy of a piece of land that was his. He told her about the night he lost it, and the exact quality of the darkness that followed. She listened to all of it, and when he was done, she told him things she had not told anyone, about the 3 years in Galveston spent building a careful, controlled, competent life that was missing some essential element she could not name then but could name now. About the suitor in Galveston, a decent schoolteacher named Bernard who had wanted to marry her, and to whom she had said no without fully understanding why, and who she now understood she had said no to because she was waiting, not for a specific person, but for a specific quality of recognition, the feeling of being seen wholly and valued wholly, which was what Orville gave her simply by being himself in her presence. He said, "Bernard sounds like a perfectly acceptable man." "He was," she agreed. "I'm grateful to him," Orville said. "For what?" she asked. For being acceptable instead of right, he said, it left you available. She smiled at him across the new kitchen table and reached over and covered his hand with hers. I have been thinking, she said, about the spring wheat planting. So have I, he said. I cannot do it alone, she said. Not at the scale I need to do it to make this farm sustainable. Davy is a good worker, but he is 16 and goes home at night. I know, he said. I am not asking you to stay out of necessity, she said carefully. I want to be clear about that. If the only thing between you and leaving this town was my needing help with the spring planting, I would find another arrangement. I know that too, he said. So when I ask you if you would consider staying, she said, I am asking for the other reason. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. Yes, he said. Yes to what, she said. Yes to everything you are saying and not saying, he said. Yes to the spring planting and the farm and the other reason and all of it. She looked at him with shining eyes. You should know, she said, that this is still a heavily indebted property with a complicated legal history and a granary that is only 60% full. I know, he said. I helped make it that way. You also helped save it, she said. We saved it, he said firmly. You found the clause, you went to the bank. You held the line with Shaughnessy. You were ready for every one of Pruitt's questions. I provided some information and some hands. Your hands, she said softly, have been the most consistent and reliable thing in my life since October. He looked at her with an expression that was completely open and unguarded, the expression of a man who has set down his armor and has no intention of picking it back up. January arrived, and with it the business of planning the spring wheat season in earnest. Orville formally ended his arrangement with the Daly property, settling his accounts with Franklin daily over coffee, and took on the Wainwright farm as his primary employment, with the explicit understanding between himself and Wilhelmina that this was both professional and personal, and that neither of them was confused about the nature of the arrangement. He moved his belongings from the barn bunk to the small spare room in the farmhouse, which was Wilhelmina's practical and unsentimental way of acknowledging what they were to each other while maintaining the particular order and propriety she had been raised with. They were not yet married. They would be. The progression was clear to both of them without requiring discussion. The discussion, when it came, arrived not from Orville but from Wilhelmina, which was entirely characteristic. It was the third week of January, a cold, clear evening, and they were both at the kitchen table, he going over the seed order and she reviewing the spring planting calendar, and she set her pencil down and looked at him with a direct expression and said, I want to marry you. He looked up from the seed order. I wanted to ask you first, she said, because I am the owner of this property and the one who controls the terms of my own life, and I wanted to make sure you understood that this is not a matter of convention or necessity but a matter of genuine desire. Wilhelmina, he said. Yes, she said. I was going to ask you in the spring, he said, after the wheat was in the ground and the legal situation was fully resolved and I had something more to offer you. What do you have to offer me now? She asked. My hands, he said, and everything else I am. That is exactly what I want, she said. He set down the seed order and reached across the table and took her hand and turned it over and pressed his lips to her palm, and she watched him do it with her heart so full she felt it in her throat. Yes, he said, looking up at her. I will marry you. Good, she said briskly, and picked up her pencil, but she was smiling the kind of smile she could not have stopped even if she had wanted to, the kind that comes from the absolute center of happiness. They married on the 14th of February, 1883, a date selected with Wilhelmina's characteristic combination of practicality and sentiment. The ceremony was small and held at the Harlow Creek Church, the one with the leaning steeple, performed by a minister named Reverend Elias Croft, who was 80 years old and slightly deaf, but who had married Theodore and Catherine Wainwright 31 years before, and who wept openly during the vows in a way that he appeared entirely unbothered by. Mrs. Garrity attended and brought preserved peaches. Franklin daily attended and shook Orville's hand again for a very long time. Davy Sims attended in a new collar that his mother had starched into aggressive formality, and stood in the front row beaming. Harlan Taft came all the way from Brenham, which nobody had expected, and sat at the back of the church with his white beard and his land records memory and an expression of profound satisfaction. Cornelius Shaughnessy did not attend, which nobody minded. The vows were simple because both Wilhelmina and Orville agreed that simple was more honest. They looked at each other while they said them with the clear-eyed certainty of people who have been through something true together, and found themselves on the same side of it every time. When Reverend Croft pronounced them married, Orville kissed her with great seriousness and gentleness, and she held his face in her hands as he had held hers on Christmas Eve, and the church was very quiet for a moment before Mrs. Garrity began applauding with an enthusiasm that set everyone else in motion. The spring planting of 1883 went in on schedule in March, 5 weeks after their wedding. They planted hard red winter wheat across 320 acres, with the northern quarter reserved for the barley rotation that Orville had established the previous fall as the foundation of a two-crop system that spread financial risk more broadly than single-crop wheat farming allowed. The planting itself was the first time they worked the land as husband and wife, and the quality of it was different from the previous year's frantic salvage operation. It was deliberate and unhurried, planned carefully through the winter evenings at the kitchen table that Orville had built. They moved through the rows together in the March sunshine with a shared rhythm that was not only practical but deeply satisfying, the rhythm of two people who had made a choice and were living fully inside it. Davy Sims, now in his second season as their helper, had grown 4 inches over the winter and arrived in March with a considerably improved grasp of wheat cultivation, and a new seriousness that made Wilhelmina suspect his mother had had a conversation with him about the importance of the Wainwright farm's success to his own continued employment. By April the seedlings were up, thin green lines of promise running in clean parallel rows across the Texas plain. Wilhelmina stood at the fence line in the evenings again, as she had done the previous year, but the expression on her face was different now. The pride was still there and the watchfulness was still there, but the worry had changed its nature, become a working worry rather than a desperate one, the worry of someone who has something real to protect rather than someone who is fighting to keep from losing everything. Orville stood beside her at the fence line on an evening in late April, his shoulder against hers, looking at the young wheat. "Looks good," he said. "It does," she said. "Better than last year at this point," he said. "Much better," she agreed. "The irrigation changes you made to the West Channel made a difference already." He nodded. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, which was one of their best qualities together, the ability to share silence without filling it artificially. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "I went to see Dr. Palmer yesterday," she said. He waited. "We are going to have a child," she said. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable kind. It was the silence of something enormous arriving, something you have considered abstractly and suddenly encounters you concretely. Then Orville turned to face her fully, and she saw the expression on his face, and felt whatever small uncertainty she had been carrying about how he would receive this news dissolve completely. He was looking at her with a joy so genuine and so unmanaged that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the joy of a man who has been handed something he had stopped believing he was allowed to want. He reached out and held her face in both hands, that gesture that was entirely his, and she held his wrists, and he pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. "November," he repeated as though the word was remarkable. "I am perfectly well," she added. "Dr. Palmer said everything is as it should be." "Good," he said, and his voice was slightly rough. She smiled at him, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and they stood together at the fence line in the April evening, with the green wheat coming up behind them, and the future arriving in the particular undeniable way that futures do, one day at a time, each one building on the last. The summer of 1883 was a season of steady work and deepening happiness. The wheat grew well, benefiting from a reasonable rainfall pattern and the improved irrigation system Orville had redesigned over the winter. The barley in the northern quarter was looking at another strong performance. Wilhelmina managed the farm books and the supplier relationships and the bank communications with the same fierce competence she brought to everything. And the new bank manager who had replaced the suspended Prude arrangement proved to be a straightforward man who responded to clear accounting with clear approvals. Wilhelmina's pregnancy progressed without difficulty. She continued to work the farm through the summer, modifying the physical labor as her body changed and accepting help, without losing the quality of capable independence that she had always carried as both shield and expression of self. Orville was attentive without being anxious, which was exactly the quality she needed, the attentiveness that trusts rather than hovers. Dr. Palmer came by in July and August and pronounced everything on track. Mrs. Garrity brought a quilt she had made herself, pale yellow and white, with a precision of stitching that was almost architectural. Davy Sims's mother arrived one August afternoon with a cradle that had belonged to her own family, refinished to a warm glow, which she presented with a directness that bypassed sentiment entirely and arrived at something more substantial. The wheat harvest of 1883 came in October, almost exactly 1 year after the Black Norther had destroyed Wilhelmina's first harvest. The difference between the 2 Octobers was so complete that she found herself standing in the north field on the first day of harvest, watching the golden stalks wave in the morning breeze, thinking about the woman who had knelt in this same spot a year ago with her hands pressed into dead earth and wept. That woman was not gone. She was still in here, still the one who had built this farm from grief and debt and determination, but she was no longer alone in it. Orville came up beside her and she reached for his hand without looking. "Good harvest," he said. "Very good," she agreed. "Better than anything Chester Burroughs ever managed," he said. She laughed. "That is not a high bar." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. They brought in the harvest over 10 days, with Davy Sims and 2 additional workers they had hired for the season. And when the granary was full, genuinely full for the first time since Wilhelmina had returned to the Wainwright farm, she stood inside it in the dusty golden light and breathed in the smell of abundant grain with something so close to joy it was essentially indistinguishable. She sold enough of the harvest to clear the remaining restructured bank debt entirely, which she did with the distinct pleasure of a woman who had been told by the shape of the world that she would not manage it, and who had managed it anyway. The payment was made in person. She delivered the bank draft to the new manager herself, signed it with her full name, and walked out of the First National Bank of Harlow Creek as a woman who owned her 400 acres free and clear. Orville was waiting outside with the wagon. "Done," he said. "Done," she said, climbing up. He turned the horses toward home, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hand through his arm and the free October sky overhead and the debt finished behind her, and she felt the completeness of it settle through her like warm water. "We should plant an orchard," she said. He looked at her. "In the spring," she said. "Along the southern fence line, apple trees. It would take years to produce, I know, but I am thinking about the long term." He smiled, a full, genuine smile that was one of her favorite sights in the world. "Apple trees," he said. "And possibly pear," she said. "Pear is harder in this climate," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to try anyway." "Yes," he said. "We will try." Their son was born on the 9th of November, 1883, which Wilhelmina calculated was almost exactly 14 months from the morning of the ruined harvest, which gave her a private sense of something completed, one calendar of grief giving way to another of arrival. The labor was difficult in the way that first labors often are. 16 hours that tested Wilhelmina's considerable fortitude against something larger than fortitude. And Orville spent most of those 16 hours in the kitchen at the table he had built, because Dr. Palmer and Mrs. Garrity, who had appointed herself birth assistant without being specifically asked, had firmly relocated him there. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface, not praying exactly, not doing anything exactly, simply being as present as he could be through the walls of the house. When he finally heard the cry of a new voice, high and indignant and utterly alive, he put his hands over his face and breathed. They named him Theodore James Wilcox, Theodore for Wilhelmina's father and James for Orville's, and he arrived into the world with his mother's auburn hair and his father's dark eyes, and a general appearance of furious determination that Mrs. Garrity said meant he would be either a preacher or a judge. Wilhelmina said he would be whatever he chose. Orville held his son for the first time on the morning of November 10th in the winter light of the farmhouse bedroom, and looked at him with the focused intensity of a man examining something that contains everything important. And Wilhelmina watched her husband's face and understood that the dark past he had carried for years, the homestead lost, the drift and the reconstruction, had finished its long resolution in this moment, not erased but completed. The way a chapter ends by becoming part of a larger story. He has your chin, Wilhelmina said. He has your eyebrows, Orville said. His own expression, though, she said. Entirely his own, Orville agreed. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the most content winter either of them had known as adults. The farm was established and solvent. The bank debt was cleared. The legal challenge against Prout and Ferris had created a precedent that the San Antonio lawyer had used to challenge 2 other forced sales in the county, with outcomes still pending but looking favorable. Harlow Creek had settled into a new relationship with the Wainwright farm, one that carried a respect earned specifically and not inherited generally. Harlan Taft wrote from Brenham in December to say that the Texas Land Office had opened a broader investigation into Ferris's land activities across the state, using the pattern documentation that he and Orville had assembled. He was pleased about this in the understated manner of a man who had spent 30 years in the land records business and was accustomed to seeing how slow and thorough justice moved, and was content to have contributed to its eventual arrival. The winter evenings were long, and the farmhouse was warm, and Theodore James slept in his cradle with the composure of a child who had arrived in a secure place and knew it. Wilhelmina read in the evenings, and Orville worked on small repairs around the house, and they talked across the comfortable domestic space between them about everything and nothing, about the orchard plan and the seed varieties for spring, and what they had read, and what they thought, and what they remembered, and what they hoped. It was a life built from honest material, from the ruined field and the steady hands and the patient endurance of real difficulty, and it had the solidity that such lives have when they are built correctly, not ornamental but structural, not perfect but true. Spring came early in 1884, and with it the apple tree planting along the southern fence line. 12 trees in 2 parallel rows, McIntosh and golden delicious varieties recommended by a tree supplier in San Antonio who wrote back regarding Wilhelmina's letter with detailed advice on soil preparation and spacing. Orville and Wilhelmina planted them together on a warm March Saturday, while Theodore James, now 4 months old and taking an energetic interest in the world, observed from a sling on Wilhelmina's back with his father's dark eyes moving over everything with focused attention. Davy Sims, 17 now and considerably more useful than his original 16-year-old self, helped dig the planting holes with the concentrated effort of someone who had started to understand that the Wainwright farm's success had a direct bearing on his own prospects, and took that seriously. As the last tree went into the ground, Wilhelmina stood back and looked at the row of small, bare, impossibly hopeful saplings, and thought about the word future in a way she had not been able to think about it a year and a half earlier, not as a thing to be survived, but as a thing to be grown, year by year slowly, with patience and attention and good soil and the willingness to wait. "They won't produce for 3 or 4 years," Orville said beside her. "I know," she said. The pear is going to be a real experiment, he said. Also I know, she said. Theodore James made an opinion-shaped sound from the sling and she reached back to pat him without looking. Are you happy? She asked Orville, not performing the question, not asking for reassurance, genuinely asking with the directness that was her natural mode. He looked at her and at the farm and at the sun on her back and at the rows of planting and at the green wheat fields beyond and at the sky above the Texas plain that was the exact color of something beginning. Yes, he said. Good, she said. She took his hand and they stood together in the March sunshine looking at their orchard, which was small and bare and years from bearing fruit, which was also the most honest metaphor for anything they had built together, requiring time and patience and care and soil, and the belief that what you put your hands to and hope today will one day give you something worth waiting for. The wheat came in strong that summer of 1884. The barley rotation continued to provide both yield and soil benefits. The apple trees pushed out their first tentative leaves. Theodore James learned to pull himself to standing at the legs of the kitchen table, looking up at the surface with his father's expression of focused assessment, and then fell down, and stood up again, and fell down, and stood up again, with the same patient persistence that ran through both of his parents. By the end of 1884, Orville and Wilhelmina had begun talking about what they wanted the Wainwright farm to look like in 10 years, in 20. They talked about whether the farm could expand, whether the plot to the south that was currently unused scrub might be purchasable when the owner, an absentee investor in Houston, decided to sell. They talked about what their children might want, using the plural naturally, neither of them having decided against the idea of Theodore James having company in due course. The legal proceedings against Gerald Prout concluded in February 1885. He was removed from the bank board permanently and fined significantly, and the ruling established a county precedent against manipulative lending practices that the San Antonio lawyer described in his letter as a genuine and lasting achievement. Prout did not go to jail, which was a justice system limitation rather than a moral one, but he was finished in the land and banking business in this county, and the families he had wronged had received at least partial remediation. Dalton Ferris was a different matter. The Texas Land Office investigation moved at the pace of state government, which was not fast, but by 1885 there were formal charges pending against him in 3 counties, and a wanted notice had been issued that made his return to Harlow Creek or any neighboring territory inadvisable for him. He had disappeared into the spaces of the Western territories where such men sometimes managed to continue operating, but the net around him was drawing tighter, and Orville followed the proceedings in the newspaper reports with a patient attention that was neither vengeance nor obsession, but the legitimate interest of someone who had a stake in the proper functioning of justice. When the first word came in 1886 that Ferris had been arrested in New Mexico territory and extradited to Texas to face the charges, Orville read the newspaper article at the kitchen table and folded the paper closed and sat quietly for a moment. Wilhelmina watched him. "Done," she said. "Getting there," he said. Then very quietly, "It won't give back the land I lost." "No," she said. "But it means it won't happen the same way to someone else," he said. "Yes," she said. "That matters." He looked at her. "It matters a great deal," he said. She came around the table and sat beside him and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with the morning coffee, and the folded newspaper, and the particular peace of 2 people who have lived through the full range of a thing, and arrived on the other side of it intact. By the spring of 1886, Wilhelmina was expecting their second child, and the orchard trees along the southern fence line were showing the first tiny blossoms that meant fruit was coming in the fall, 3 years after planting, right on schedule for the Macintosh variety, and slightly early for the Golden Delicious. The farm had expanded by 30 acres, purchased from the Houston investor, who had finally decided to liquidate in the way that absentee investors eventually did. The additional land was planted in a mixed rotation that Orville had designed specifically for the slightly different soil composition of the newly acquired plot. Davy Sims, now 18 and capable and indispensable, had taken on a supervisory role over 2 younger laborers that the farm now employed seasonally, a transition in responsibility that he managed with a seriousness that made Wilhelmina think about what he might become if given the right opportunities, and which led to a conversation with him in which she offered to allow him, in future, to farm a portion of the new 30 acres on a profit-sharing arrangement rather than a flat wage, which was the kind of offer that changed a young person's relationship to their own future. Davy had stood in the kitchen listening to this offer with a face that was not quite steady, and then said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that was doing its best to be casual and not quite managing it. Their daughter was born in September 1886, a second difficult labor that Orville spent in the kitchen again with his hands on the table, and when she arrived, she was loud and specific, and looked at everything in the room within hours of arrival with an attentiveness that both her parents recognized immediately. They named her Catherine Eleanor Wilcox, Catherine for Wilhelmina's mother and Eleanor, because it was a name both of them liked for reasons neither could entirely articulate, which seemed to them a reasonable basis for naming a person. The fall of 1886 brought the first apple harvest from the orchard along the southern fence line. It was a modest harvest, as first harvests from young trees are, perhaps 40 pounds total from 12 trees, but the apples were firm and sweet and genuinely excellent, and Wilhelmina stood in the orchard in the October afternoon light with a basket of them, and ate one slowly, and thought about the years of waiting and the quality of what the waiting had produced. Orville came up from the south field and saw her there and ate an apple standing beside her and said, "You were right about the orchard." "I am frequently right," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I love about you." "Only one," she said. "The list is long," he said. "I'm starting there for efficiency." She laughed and gave him another apple, and they walked back up to the farmhouse together through the golden afternoon, this man and this woman on their own land, this farm that was alive and producing and entirely theirs, this life that had been built not from easy things but from honest ones, from getting on your knees in ruined fields and pressing your hands against dead earth and refusing to leave, from offering not words when words would fail but presence and practical skill, and the willingness to stay. Theodore James, now 3 years old and deeply interested in everything, came running from the porch at the sight of the apple basket, and was given one by each parent simultaneously, which he received with the particular satisfaction of a child who is the center of considerable love, and has completely internalized this as the natural order of things. Catherine Eleanor slept in the farmhouse, small and new and already herself, already making her own patterns in the world she had arrived in. The Wainwright farm, free of debt and rich in harvest, stood solid under the October sky with its 430 acres of wheat and barley, its orchard with its first bearing season complete, its granary full, its future running out ahead of it in both directions like a road that has been properly graded and runs true. Wilhelmina Wainwright Wilcox stood at the kitchen window in the last of the October evening light, while Orville read to Theodore James in the next room, the child's periodic satisfied sounds audible through the wall, and she held Catherine Eleanor against her shoulder, and looked out at the wheat fields and the orchard and the dark shape of the granary against the sky, and she felt the full weight of everything she had built and everything she had been given and everything she had chosen, all of it present simultaneously, all of it real. In the spring of 1888, they planted 2 more apple trees and 3 pear trees along the fence extension, and the pear trees were a real experiment, just as Orville had said, requiring more attention and more particular soil management than the apples, but that was all right. They had learned from the wheat and the barley and the first orchard planting that the things worth having in this particular life were often the things that required more care, and that the caring was not a burden but part of the meaning. Theodore James would start school in Harlow Creek that fall, and was preparing for this with the mixture of interest and independence that characterized him, while Catherine Aliner, not yet 2, watched everything her brother did with the focused attention that was already recognizably her own. Orville and Wilhelmina stood together at the fence line one evening in May of 1888, the air warm and soft, the wheat a few weeks from its third harvest together, the pear trees small and tentative in their new soil, the apple trees tall and settled, and part of the landscape now in the way of things that have found their right place. "The pear trees look uncertain," Orville said. "They will find their footing," Wilhelmina said. "You always say that," he said. "Because it is always true," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and the sun went down over the Texas plain in the slow, extravagant way of plain sunsets, painting the sky in colors that had no practical application and were beautiful anyway. And the farm was quiet, and the children were inside with Davy's mother, who had become, over the years, someone to whom Wilhelmina applied the word family without reservation, and everything that had been broken was made. And everything that had been lost had found its form, and the land that had been worth fighting for was simply and entirely home. What had begun in a ruined field on an October morning with a man getting on his knees and pressing his hands into dead earth, offering not words but presence, not pity but partnership, had become this, had become everything, had become a life so thoroughly made and lived that neither of them could imagine the shape of the world before it, which was, in the end, exactly what love was for.